Hello, dear friends. In my last video in this series, I introduced the idea that we need good stories in our lives even more than we might have realized. Make sure to watch it before you continue the quest with me today, because you might find yourself at the edge of the dark forest with man-eating wolves running by your peripheral vision, and you might not know what to do. Hint, the right thing to do is find a stump, sit on it, and start to cry. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Allow me to tell you a story. In spite of talking much on previous videos about the virtues of stories in helping us become courageous and resilient, last year I repeatedly failed to listen to my own advice. Those of you who are paying attention will, of course, recognize that I was in the repeating goal and disaster or try-fail sequence of my own heroic quest. I was being neither courageous nor resilient in the face of not so much the pandemic as what I perceive to be a massively psychotic response to the pandemic. Unfortunately, and this is why heroes must go out into the wilderness to fight dragons and not fight them at home, my wife and children were bearing the brunt of these failures. I tried to buck myself up with some sober reading. After all, that's what I preached to others, so it has to work. And it didn't. Something was missing. The answer suggested itself totally serendipitously right before Great Lent 2021. I had been reading Robert Macfarlane's Underland, one of the great literary masterpieces of nature writing, in which we encounter, among many wonderful characters, a certain mushroom scientist, yes, mushroom scientist, named Merlin Sheldrake. And if that's not a fairy tale name, I don't know what is. Merlin tells of the wonders of a mushroom's mycelium, the underground part of a mushroom, the roots, that can take up huge, vast swaths of territory, making one such mushroom in Oregon by far the largest organism on Earth. Sorry, blue whale. One of the amazing things he revealed was that mushrooms make possible the life of the entire overstory of the forest. That's because, in order to feed itself, the mycelium facilitates nutrient transfer between plants of different species. Not the same species, notice, different ones. I was astounded at this because it shouldn't be possible in a strictly Darwinian universe, a point that even Merlin Sheldrake himself makes, as I was delighted to see. Okay, so far so good. It was an interesting fact, maybe. But this fact became a personal story for me when, in a course with Paul Kingsnorth, I made the connection between the roots of the forest, so to speak, and the roots of human community. The mushroom's roots make possible a community of vastly different types of plants in a way that really shouldn't be possible in a survival of the fittest kind of world. So my thought was, what was preventing me, and maybe others, but first of all me, from being rooted like the mushroom, to facilitate the thriving life of my family, my friends, and my community? That thought really affected me, and it has continued to haunt me since. To become rooted, to have deep roots, that's the thing that we in the prosperous West seem to lack. And certainly that's one of the reasons that we are becoming more and more fragmented as a civilization. I certainly think so. And let's be honest, it's not just us now in COVID land. It's part of the human condition. Listen to this quote, slightly adapted from the original text from a modern theologian who distilled some of the thoughts of 7th century theologian Maximus the Confessor. Quote, "There is a spiritual death in the passionate marching back and forth, produced in the vicious circle formed by perceptible pleasure and pain." Here we encounter a contradiction of the human condition. There is an alternating, if not a joining, of the state of passion and the commonplace, of effervescence and boredom, of tension and aridity. There is a death which tortures, a living death, not the death which gives the rest of non-being. Man's life of dullness, of superficial banality, in which the spirit has succumbed, seems never ending in this life. But in the future life, the fact is it won't be. It will give man the kind of infinity he wanted, an infinity of dullness. This is a wonderful quote, I think, because it really captures the simultaneous reality of us being in pain, but also being in a state of complete diffidence and a complete lack of feeling, lack of emotion that really is coming to the fore, especially in COVID land. And we see this, interestingly enough, in something that I hadn't noticed until recently, though it's so pervasive that even the New Yorker had a story on it. This is the ever presence of something called the trauma plot. You probably will notice as soon as I mention it, what I'm talking about. It seems like almost every protagonist in streaming series, in books, in movies that we watch nowadays seem to have deeply repressed trauma. And the stories we watch are all driven by that trauma. And the uncovering of that trauma is part of the way that these stories unfold. It's the central theme of WandaVision. And it's one of the weaknesses of that story, actually, I think. The central driving emotion of the Netflix series Arcane is all about trauma and its deep, deep scars. The best episode of The Witcher, of the second season of The Witcher, comes from the dramatic decisions inspired by intense trauma. It even shows up in Ted Lasso, for goodness sake. And even the New Yorker is now crying foul. Here's a quote from that article, which is called The Case Against the Trauma Plot, if you want to look it up. Quote, trauma came to be accepted as a totalizing identity. Lines from a Terence Hayes sonnet come to mind. I thought we might sing of the wire wound round the wound of feeling. That wire around the wound, it might be trauma's cultural script, a concept that bites into the flesh so deeply it's difficult to see that it's historically contingent. The claim that trauma's imprint is a timeless feature of our species, that it etches itself onto the human brain in a distant way, ignores how trauma has been evolving. Traumatic flashbacks, in fact, were reported only after the invention of film. Isn't that interesting? This calls to mind a conversation I had with novelist and illustrator Vesper Stamper about the way children deal with trauma. In that conversation, we danced around the notion that it was stories and storytelling that helped these children make sense of suffering. But it's even more than that. In previous ages, with previous generations, you had a lot more rootedness. People were rooted. They had roots. These were roots of long intergenerational familial relationships. They were the roots of a shared history, geography, the roots finally of a common storytelling tradition. Well, darn it, isn't that the one thing we moderns don't have? Instead, we have the common trauma plot, which more often than not doesn't make meaning out of the pain, but revels in a kind of post-pain banality of total unfeeling. So what do? We start putting down roots, and we do that by reading fairy tales. Let me explain why. In that series of essays by Paul Kingsnorth that I mentioned last time, he shared the image of something he called the Platonic flower. If you're a subscriber to my newsletter, you will see that image in the email. If you're not, you'll have to imagine it as I describe it. It's a picture of a daffodil, pencil drawn, with the flower stem and roots all visible as if in cross-section. The roots represent the darkness of opinion and estimation. In other words, the potential of an idea. The stem represents the flowering of the chaotic potential into a concrete idea. And the flower, which points at the sun being the source of true knowledge, towards which we are always reaching, is the flowering of that idea in its best possible form. The point of that image in Kingsnorth's essay was this: what can we possibly expect from social media, from blogs, from our cultural discourse, and from the stories that we tell each other and ourselves if our noetic flowers have shallow roots, or worse, no roots at all? Well, we can expect flaccid flowers, maybe even dead ones, pressed between the pages of a book to preserve the semblance of what might have been. And we look at it and we pretend what a beautiful flower this is. We can't expect anything transformative from this kind of a process. And that's the point. We can't live well, and we won't, unless our roots are given a chance to deepen. And those roots, by the way, are in the human heart, not the human head. The heart is a very misunderstood and a very badly cultivated organ. And no, I don't mean the physical beating heart of the person. To even know what that looks like, to even have a conception of it as a distinct organ, requires that we cut open a person after he dies. That's not the common historical experience of what the human heart is. I'm talking about the living heart of a person, his deepest, his most personal self. There's something of the physical, there's something of the transcendent in it as well. That's the part that we neglect so often in our constant busyness, our rushing around, our movement, in our fears of facing ourselves, especially during this pandemic. And it's only gotten worse. That's the part that I found I had neglected so much, to the detriment of my own relationship with my wife and children. There are many reasons that I didn't, that we don't cultivate it. And there are many ways that we can begin to cultivate it. But one surefire way that we can start the difficult process of rooting deep into ourselves to allow that noetic flower to grow is to read fairy tales. But wait, fairy tales don't make any sense. They're chaotic. So many weird things happen. How can they be possibly useful for us? Well, I'm going to ignore that last question because you just asked the usefulness of a story, and I'm just going to cry foul. But actually, my answer is yes. Exactly. You've hit on all the right points. Because fairy tales, they come out of a deep, rooted tradition of storytelling that has been going on for millennia. It is the distillation, or better yet, the flowering of a soul of a people. And to partake of that deep-rooted tradition is to find consolation for the weary or pained heart. But how? You insist. Fairy tales are not built on rational principles. They're not built on rational structures of dramatic action. Instead, they have a different point. They are told in order to reflect the basic order of the world, the way that the world is. They reflect the deep reality of the way things are, of how people act, of how we love, how we fear, how we hate, and how we can transcend ourselves. And these stories, they tell it in a way that speaks not to the rational mind, but directly past the mind to the heart. The wonderful author Peter S. Beagle, through the character of Prince Lear in The Last Unicorn, puts this absolutely gorgeously. Here's what he says, quote, the true secret of being a hero lies in knowing the order of things. The swineherd cannot already be wed to the princess when he embarks on his adventures, nor can the boy knock at the witch's door when she's away on vacation. The wicked uncle cannot be found out and foiled before he does something wicked. Things must happen when it is time for them to happen. Quests can't just simply be abandoned. Prophecies may not be left to rot like unpicked fruit. Unicorns may go unrescued for a long time, but not forever. The happy ending cannot come in the middle of the story. There's so much wisdom here. I just love it. As I said last time, like it or not, we are all heroes in our own stories. This is just how we conceptualize our lives. This is how we look at the world. But since we've lost that common thread of storytelling traditions through fairy tales that helped our ancestors be heroes, that actually know what to do in the story of their lives, we're lost. Our ancestors knew that if you found yourself without your horse in the middle of a dangerous wood, you don't go looking for it. You don't go screaming, chopping trees down. You don't go back to the village. What do? You sit on a stump and you weep. Why? Well, because that humility is the only possible pose that can attract the help of the wild and dangerous magical creatures that live in that forest. It's the only way it can prevent them from eating you. After all, humility is the only pose that attracts the love and attention and community of others. So that's my message to you today. Find those old stories. The older, the better. And there are some good ones and some bad ones, and you have to be careful. You have to be careful about which ones you choose. But generally speaking, if they're really old, they're probably going to be good. But don't analyze them. Don't try to understand them, because they speak in a language of the heart, not the mind. As Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin said, quote, fairy tales are not fabrications or tall tales. They are poetic illumination, essential reality, even the beginning of all philosophy. Fairy tales don't become obsolete if we lose the wisdom to live by them. No, it is we who have perverted our emotional and spiritual culture. We will dissipate and die off if we lose access to these tales, unquote. Strong words. But if you do need a bit of help navigating these difficult forests of fairy tales, I do have a podcast available wherever you listen to podcasts. It's called In a Certain Kingdom. And there I retell Russian fairy tales, and I provide some small analysis, but that analysis is aimed more at your heart and not at your mind. Maybe they can be consoling to you in this dark winter. Still, this is only step one. Because if we fill ourselves with the wisdom of fairy tales, we've in some sense managed to meet ourselves, come face to face with our own hearts in a deeply rooted way. But we still need to extend outward to share that rootedness with others. And that's what I'm going to talk about in our next video coming next week. As a reminder, if you want to go deeper into this with me and sit in while I record the rest of this series, join my Patreon community. I will be recording these videos live with my patrons in an exclusive Zoom room where they will have a chance to recommend, to comment, and to help me shape the direction of future videos. Go to patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar if you're interested. I hope to see you there.